What would you do if the world turned its back on you, only for a billionaire to rewrite your destiny? 13-year-old Ethan Harper sat on the cold, unforgiving steps of Elite Crest Academy, his frayed backpack pressed against his chest like a shield, the weight of rejection crushing his young spirit. His hazel eyes burned with unshed tears as Principal Victor Langston's cruel words echoed in his mind. This academy isn't for someone like you. The sting of humiliation was raw. Students had laughed, their whispers slicing through him like a blade, each snicker a reminder of his place in their world. But the very next day, the campus trembled as a sleek silver helicopter descended onto the courtyard, its blades slicing the air with a thunderous roar that drowned out the morning chatter. A billionaire stepped out, his steely gaze locked on Ethan, and in that moment, everything was about to change. Ethan's heart raced as he sat there, the memory of his expulsion playing on a loop in his mind. He could still hear the laughter, feel the judgmental stares of his peers, their polished uniforms a stark contrast to his worn-out sneakers, the soles peeling at the edges. His mother, a single parent working 2 jobs as a waitress, had sacrificed everything to get him into this prestigious school, nights spent scrubbing tables, her hands calloused, her back bent, all for him. Now, it was all gone, or so he thought. As the billionaire's shadow loomed closer, Ethan's mind spun with possibilities, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. What would happen next? Imagine you're Ethan, standing on the edge of despair, when a stranger arrives to change your fate. What do you think happens next? Comment below with option 1. The billionaire confronts the principal in front of everyone, or option 2. The billionaire takes Ethan away to a new school. Let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories. We're working hard to share powerful, real-life stories that inspire hope, courage, and kindness. Getting to 1,000 subscribers is a huge milestone, and your support truly keeps us going. Thank you for being part of this journey. You're not just a viewer, you're family. The morning after Ethan's expulsion, the students of Elite Crest Academy strutted onto campus, their designer bags swinging, their laughter filling the air with a carefree arrogance that Ethan had always envied. The sun glinted off the school's towering glass facade, a monument to wealth and privilege, while the scent of freshly cut grass from the courtyard mingled with the faint perfume of luxury that clung to the students' uniforms. But a sudden, deafening roar shattered the morning calm, a sound so jarring that even the most self-assured students froze mid-step. Heads turned, jaws dropped, as a silver helicopter descended onto the school's pristine courtyard, its blades kicking up dust and sending papers spiraling through the air like frantic birds. Teachers rushed out, their faces etched with confusion, clutching their lesson plans as if they could shield them from the chaos. Students gasped, fumbling for their phones to capture the spectacle, their voices a chaotic hum of excitement and disbelief. Principal Victor Langston emerged from his office, his brow furrowed as he shielded his eyes from the gusts, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement with a hurried rhythm. "What in heaven's name is this?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the whirring blades, his usual air of control fraying at the edges. The helicopter's door slid open with a mechanical hiss, and a man stepped out, tall, imposing, dressed in a charcoal suit that screamed wealth. His steely blue eyes scanned the crowd with an intensity that made the air grow heavy, as if the very atmosphere was bending to his will. Students whispered, their voices a mix of awe and fear, while teachers fidgeted, their hands smoothing their ties or skirts in a nervous tick. A tense silence fell over the campus, broken only by the slowing whir of the helicopter blades. Then, the man's voice cut through the stillness, deep and commanding, each word landing like a stone in a still pond. "I'm here for Ethan Harper." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, a wave of shock that seemed to pull the air from the courtyard. Every eye turned to Ethan, who stood frozen at the edge of the steps, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. His frayed backpack slipped from his shoulder, landing with a soft thud on the stone steps, the sound swallowed by the weight of the moment. The same students who had mocked him yesterday now stared in wide-eyed disbelief, their sneers replaced by confusion. Principal Langston's face drained of color, his usual air of authority replaced by a flicker of unease that Ethan had never seen before. He adjusted his tie, stepping forward with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm sorry, sir, but may I ask who you are? His voice, usually sharp with control, trembled at the edges, betraying the fear that was beginning to take root. The man's gaze locked onto Langston, sharp as a dagger, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw the principal flinch. Damian Sterling, the man said, his voice steady, unyielding. The name sent a shockwave through the crowd, a ripple of recognition that turned whispers into gasps. Damian Sterling, billionaire philanthropist, tech mogul, and one of the most influential men in the world. His empire spanned continents, his name synonymous with power, a name that could make or break fortunes with a single phone call. Ethan's stomach twisted into knots, a mix of fear and hope churning inside him. Why was this man here? What could he possibly want with someone like him? A nobody, a boy who couldn't even afford the school's uniform without his mother working double shifts. Principal Langston swallowed hard, his lips twitching into a nervous grin that looked more like a grimace. Mr. Sterling, it's an honor to have you at Elite Crest Academy. What brings you here? His words were polite, but there was an edge to them, a desperate attempt to regain control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers. Damian's expression remained unreadable, his face a mask of calm authority. He extended a hand, and his assistant, a poised woman in a navy blazer with a no-nonsense air, handed him a sleek leather folder. Without breaking eye contact with Langston, he flipped it open, the sound of the pages rustling cutting through the tense silence. I was informed that a student was expelled from this institution due to his financial background, Damian said, his voice cold as ice, each word deliberate, as if he were laying out a case in a courtroom. Langston's jaw tightened, his fingers fidgeting with his cufflinks, a nervous habit Ethan had noticed during the principal's many lectures about standards. Mr. Sterling, I assure you, we maintain the highest standards here, Langston began, his voice rising slightly, as if he could talk his way out of whatever was coming. Damian held up a single finger, silencing him instantly, the gesture so commanding that Langston's mouth snapped shut mid-sentence. I'm not interested in excuses, Damian said, his voice cold as ice, his eyes narrowing slightly. I want to know why Ethan Harper was humiliated and cast out like he was worthless. The whispers among the students grew louder, their eyes darting between Ethan and the principal, some of them shifting uncomfortably as if they could feel the weight of Damian's words. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest, his palms slick with sweat, the memory of yesterday's humiliation flashing through his mind. He could still hear Langston's voice, sharp and cutting, as he'd stood in the middle of the hallway, surrounded by his peers. This academy isn't for someone like you, Langston had said, his tone dripping with disdain, as if Ethan's very presence was an insult to the school's prestige. The laughter that followed had been a knife to Ethan's heart, each snicker and whispered insult carving deeper into his already fragile sense of self-worth. Now, standing here, with Damian Sterling's piercing gaze on him, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Principal Langston cleared his throat, his voice strained, as if he were forcing the words out through a clenched jaw. Well, as you must understand, Elite Crest Academy prioritizes students who, he began, but his words faltered under Damian's unrelenting stare. Damian snapped the folder shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the courtyard, making several students jump. Stop talking, he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet menace that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Langston's shoulders stiffened, a visible shiver running through him, his carefully constructed facade of authority crumbling. He forced a smile, glancing at the watching crowd, his eyes darting from student to student as if searching for an ally. Mr. Sterling, I'm certain we can resolve any misunderstanding, he said, his voice now tinged with desperation, a stark contrast to the smug confidence he'd shown when expelling Ethan. Damian's assistant stepped forward, her heels clicking against the pavement, and handed another document to the principal. This isn't a misunderstanding, she said, her tone crisp, professional, as if she were delivering a verdict. It's a transaction. Langston frowned, his fingers trembling as he took the paperwork, his eyes scanning the pages with growing alarm. His face went pale, his hands shaking as he flipped through the documents, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This says, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he couldn't bring himself to say the words aloud. Damien nodded once, his expression unyielding. As of this morning, I own Elite Crest Academy. A wave of shock coursed through the crowd, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the air from the courtyard. Students gasped, their eyes wide with disbelief, while teachers exchanged stunned looks, their hands clutching their folders tighter. Even the groundskeeper, who had been sweeping the steps, dropped his broom, the clatter echoing in the stunned silence. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his mind reeling as he tried to process what he'd just heard. Damien Sterling, the Damien Sterling, now owned the school that had rejected him? It felt like a dream, a surreal twist that he couldn't quite grasp. Langston's mouth opened and closed, his voice barely a whisper, as if he were speaking to himself. This can't be serious. Damien tilted his head, his gaze unwavering, a predator sizing up its prey. You're welcome to call your board of directors, he said, his voice calm, but laced with an edge of steel. They've already signed off on the acquisition. Your authority here is finished. Langston's forehead glistened with sweat, his composure crumbling like a house of cards in a storm. He began, but the words died in his throat as Damien took a step closer, his presence overwhelming, filling the space with an almost tangible force. And now, Damien said, his voice low and deliberate, you'll do something you should have done yesterday. He turned slightly, his gaze shifting to Ethan, and pointed at him, the gesture sending a jolt through Ethan's body. You'll apologize. Langston's face contorted with humiliation, his eyes darting around the courtyard, searching for support, but no one spoke. The teachers, the students, everyone was frozen, waiting, the tension so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on them all. Seconds stretched into an eternity, each one heavier than the last, as Langston stood there, his pride warring with the reality of his situation. Finally, with a shaky breath, he turned to Ethan, his voice barely audible, a whisper that carried the weight of his defeat. I'm sorry. Damien's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Louder. Langston's face burned red, his fists clenching at his sides, his entire body trembling with the effort of holding himself together. But he had no choice. He forced the words out again, his voice cracking with the strain. I'm sorry, Ethan. Ethan's heart pounded so hard he could barely breathe, the sound of his own pulse drowning out the whispers of the crowd. He had dreamed of this moment, of someone standing up for him, of the people who had humiliated him being forced to acknowledge their wrong. But never in his wildest dreams had he imagined it would happen like this, with a billionaire stepping out of a helicopter to rewrite his story. The apology felt like a balm to the wounds Langston had inflicted, but it also felt surreal, as if Ethan were watching someone else's life unfold. But Damien wasn't finished. He turned to the crowd, his piercing gaze sweeping over the students, the teachers, everyone who had witnessed Ethan's shame, his presence commanding every ounce of attention. Then, in a voice that brooked no argument, he said, "Now, let me tell you what happens next." A heavy silence blanketed the courtyard, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Ethan could feel every gaze on him, the weight of their stares pressing down like a physical force, a mix of curiosity, fear, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. Just yesterday, he had been discarded like trash, his dreams of a better future shattered in a single moment. Now, the most powerful man in the city stood before him, forcing the very people who had humiliated him to watch in stunned silence. Ethan's mind raced, a whirlwind of emotions, fear, hope, disbelief, swirling inside him as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Damien Sterling's voice rang out, calm but unyielding, each word a hammer striking the foundation of the school's elitist culture. "You all thought you knew who mattered in this school," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, his eyes lingering on the students who had laughed at Ethan, their faces now pale with uncertainty. "You believed wealth was the only measure of worth. You looked at a boy like Ethan and decided he was nothing. But today, you're learning how quickly power can shift." A murmur rippled through the students, a wave of unease that spread like wildfire. Some exchanged nervous glances, their hands fidgeting with their bags or phones, while others stared at Ethan, their expressions shifting from mockery to something else. Unease. maybe even regret. Principal Langston swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he tried to regain some semblance of control. "Mr. Sterling, he began, but his words were cut off by Damien's sharp gaze, a look that silenced him as effectively as a hand over his mouth. "Be quiet," Damien said, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver through the crowd. Langston's lips pressed into a thin line, his face pale, his hands trembling at his sides. Damien turned back to the crowd, his presence commanding every ounce of attention, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he took a slow, deliberate step forward. "When I look at this school, I see arrogance," he said, his voice rising slightly, each word a condemnation. "I see people who judge others based on wealth instead of merit. That ends now." He turned to his assistant, who handed him another folder, her movements precise, efficient, as if she had done this 100 times before. Damien flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages with a quiet intensity, a faint hum escaping his lips, as if he were confirming something he already knew. Then, without hesitation, he held up the document for all to see, the paper catching the sunlight and casting a shadow across the courtyard. "This is a list of staff members who will be terminated, effective immediately," he said, his voice steady, unyielding. Gasps erupted, a cacophony of shock that echoed through the courtyard. Teachers stiffened, some stepping back in alarm, their hands flying to their mouths or clutching their chests. A few whispered frantically to each other, their eyes wide with fear, while others stood frozen, as if hoping they had misheard. Langston's breath hitched, his voice cracking as he took a step forward, his hands raised in protest. You can't just," he stammered, his face a mask of panic. "I can," Damien interrupted smoothly, his voice cutting through Langston's protest like a knife through butter. "And I already have." His assistant pulled out another document, her expression impassive as she handed it to Damien. "Additionally," she said, her voice crisp, "a full review of the school's policies begins today. New leadership will be installed, and any staff found mistreating students will be permanently removed." A few students whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward Ethan, some of them shifting uncomfortably as if they could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind, his emotions a tangled mess of disbelief and gratitude. He had spent so long feeling like he didn't belong, like he was an intruder in a world that didn't want him. Now, someone was not only standing up for him, but tearing down the very system that had rejected him. It was almost too much to process, the weight of it pressing down on him like a physical force. Damien turned, locking eyes with Ethan for the first time since his arrival, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Damien's expression softened, just slightly, a flicker of something, compassion, perhaps, crossing his face. "Ethan," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less commanding, "you were judged unfairly. You deserve better." Ethan could barely find his voice, his hands trembling at his sides, his throat tight with emotion. I didn't expect this," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, the words feeling inadequate in the face of what was happening. Damien gave a small nod, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You weren't supposed to," he said, his voice warm, almost paternal. He turned back to the crowd, his voice rising, filling the courtyard with a quiet intensity that demanded attention. "I want every student here to understand something," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, his eyes lingering on the students who had laughed at Ethan, their faces now pale with uncertainty. "This boy, the one you laughed at, the one you looked down on, has more worth than any of you ever realized. And now, you'll watch as he gets everything you said he never would." He turned to his assistant, his voice firm. "Ensure his tuition is covered in full. Give him access to every resource this school offers. And if anyone has a problem with it, they can leave." The shift in the air was palpable, a seismic change that rippled through the crowd. The students who had once mocked Ethan now stared at him with wide eyes, their expressions laced with uncertainty, some of them shifting uncomfortably as if they could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. Langston took a small step back, sweat pooling at his temples, his hands trembling as he tried to process what was happening. "Mr. Sterling, what do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the last vestiges of his authority slipping away. Damien didn't even look at him, his gaze still fixed on the crowd. "I want you to pack your things," he said, his voice cold, final. A sharp breath escaped Langston's lips, his face twisting in disbelief, his eyes wide with panic. You're firing me?" he stammered, his voice cracking, the words sounding hollow in the face of Damien's unyielding resolve. Damien gave the smallest hint of a smirk, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. "I don't keep liabilities," he said, his voice low, but the words carried the weight of a judge's gavel. Langston stumbled back, his once unshakable authority crumbling like a sandcastle in the tide. Students, teachers, even the groundskeeper watched as the man who had ruled this school with an iron grip stood there, powerless, his pride stripped away in front of everyone he had once lorded over. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a quiet strength taking root where fear had once lived. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't weak. And this was only the beginning. The courtyard fell silent as Langston was escorted off the premises by 2 security guards, their hands firm on his arms as he protested weakly, his voice fading into the distance like a dying echo. Damien turned back to the students, his presence commanding but no longer cold, his steely blue eyes softening slightly as he surveyed the crowd. "This school will change," he said, his voice firm, each word a promise. "The days of power belonging only to those with the biggest bank accounts are over. From now on, students will be judged by their effort, their potential, their ambition." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of unease and intrigue. Some students looked uneasy, their hands fidgeting with their bags or phones, while others seemed intrigued, their eyes bright with the possibility of a new order. Damien's assistant stepped forward, her heels clicking against the pavement, her voice crisp and professional. "Effective immediately, scholarships will be expanded," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "No student will be expelled or denied opportunities based on their financial status. And any faculty caught mistreating students because of wealth, or lack thereof, will be removed." Ethan felt his breath hitch, a wave of emotion washing over him. This was bigger than just him, bigger than his own story. This was something that would reshape the entire school, a legacy that would outlast this moment, this day. It was a chance for every student who had ever felt like they didn't belong, a chance to be seen, to be valued. Damien turned to face him, his expression softening further, a quiet intensity in his gaze. "Ethan," he said, his voice softer now, but no less powerful, "you'll have access to every program this school offers. Tutors, extracurriculars, anything you need." Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came, his throat tight with emotion. He had spent so long fighting just to survive in this place, scraping by on the edges of a world that didn't want him. Now, someone was fighting for him, giving him a chance he had never dared to dream of. Damien studied him for a long moment, his gaze searching, as if he were looking for something deep within Ethan's soul. Then he asked, "Tell me, what do you want to do with this chance?" Ethan's heart pounded, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. This wasn't just about proving himself anymore, about showing the students who had laughed at him that he wasn't nothing. This was about showing himself, proving to the scared, lonely boy inside him that he was enough, that he belonged. "I want to be extraordinary," he finally said, his voice steady, strong, the words carrying a quiet determination that surprised even him. Damien gave a slow nod, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Then be extraordinary," he said, his voice warm, encouraging, a promise of support that Ethan felt deep in his bones. And just like that, everything changed. The moment Langston was escorted off the premises, a seismic shift rippled through Elite Crest Academy, a change so profound that no one could ignore it. The once smug teachers now whispered nervously in the hallways, their voices low, their eyes darting around as if they were waiting for the next shoe to drop. The students who had laughed at Ethan now eyed him with curiosity, maybe even guilt, their sneers replaced by uncertainty. And Ethan, he felt something new stirring inside him, a quiet strength, a sense of purpose. He was no longer invisible. That night, as Ethan sat in his small bedroom, the weight of the day pressed down on him like a heavy fog. The flickering light of a single bulb cast shadows on the peeling wallpaper, the faint hum of the bulb a constant reminder of the life he and his mother had always known. The sound of his mother washing dishes in the kitchen drifted through the thin walls, a soft clinking that was both comforting and heartbreaking. Ethan clutched the acceptance letter from Elite Crest Academy that his mother had framed, her pride evident in the way she'd hung it above his desk, the glass smudged from where she'd touched it so many times. She had worked double shifts for years, her hands calloused from scrubbing tables, her back bent from long hours, just to give him this chance. And he had failed her, or so he'd thought until today. Tears welled in his eyes as he traced the letter with his finger, the paper worn from his own touches, a symbol of his mother's unwavering belief in him. "I won't let you down, Mom," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling with emotion, a quiet fire igniting in his chest. He thought of her tired smile, the way her eyes lit up when he'd told her he'd been accepted, the way she'd hugged him so tightly he could feel her heartbeat. That memory fueled his resolve, a determination to make her proud, to show her that her sacrifices hadn't been in vain. The next day, Ethan walked through the school doors, his steps tentative at first, the weight of the past still lingering in his mind. But for the first time, no one sneered. No one whispered insults under their breath, their voices a constant reminder of his place, or lack thereof, in their world. Instead, students watched him, some cautiously, others with something closer to respect, their eyes following him as he made his way to his locker. Ethan squared his shoulders, the weight of his old life lifting just a little, a quiet confidence beginning to take root. But then, a voice cut through the air, sharp and venomous, a reminder that not everyone was ready to accept the new order. "You think one billionaire's favor changes anything?" The words were laced with venom, each one a dagger aimed at Ethan's newfound hope. Ethan turned, his stomach tightening, a flicker of fear threatening to take hold. He knew that voice, had heard it in his nightmares, the voice that had led the chorus of laughter when he'd been expelled. It was Carter Blake, the school's golden boy, wealthy, popular, untouchable, the kind of student elite Crest Academy had been built for. Carter had been one of the loudest voices laughing when Ethan was expelled, his cruel words echoing in Ethan's mind long after the moment had passed. Now, he stood there, arms crossed, his designer watch glinting under the fluorescent lights, his lip curled in a sneer that made Ethan's blood run cold. Ethan met his gaze, refusing to look away, his hands clenching into fists at his sides as he fought to hold onto the strength Damien had given him. Carter scoffed, his lip curling further, his eyes glinting with malice. "You really think you belong here now?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain, each word a challenge, a dare for Ethan to prove himself. Something inside Ethan tightened, a flicker of fear threatening to take hold, the old insecurities rising to the surface like a tide he couldn't stop. He remembered the countless times Carter had made his life miserable, the snide comments in the hallways, the way he'd accidentally knocked Ethan's books out of his hands, the laughter that always followed. But before Ethan could respond, before the fear could take over, another voice interrupted, deep and commanding, a voice that carried the weight of authority. "I think he belongs here more than you do," the voice said, each word a thunderclap that silenced the hallway. The hallway went silent, a hush falling over the students as every head turned. Damien Sterling strode toward them, his presence filling the space, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor with a steady, deliberate rhythm. Carter's smug expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, but he quickly recovered, his jaw tightening as he straightened his posture. "Mr. Sterling, he began, his voice tinged with a false confidence that didn't match the fear in his eyes. Damien barely glanced at him, his steely blue eyes fixed on Carter with an intensity that made the air grow heavy. "Let me guess," he said smoothly, his voice calm but laced with a quiet menace. "You come from money. You believe that makes you better than others. And now, you're struggling with the fact that the system you benefited from is collapsing right in front of you." Carter stiffened, his jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Damien smirked, a faint glimmer of amusement in his eyes, but there was no warmth in it. "You're predictable," he said, his voice low, the words a condemnation that hit Carter like a physical blow. Carter's fists curled tighter, his face burning red, but he said nothing, his pride warring with the reality of his situation. Damien turned to Ethan, his expression softening slightly, a quiet encouragement in his gaze. "People like him will always try to hold on to power," he said, his voice steady, reassuring. "They fear change. But change is here." Ethan took a slow breath, his fear melting away, replaced by a quiet determination that felt new, unfamiliar, but powerful. Damien studied him for a moment, his gaze searching, as if he were measuring Ethan's resolve. Then, he addressed the students who had gathered around, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Elite Crest Academy will no longer be a playground for the privileged," he said, his voice rising, each word a promise, a challenge. "If you want to succeed, you'll work for it. If you think money alone will protect you, you'll be disappointed." Carter's face burned red, his eyes glinting with a dangerous intensity as he turned and stormed off, shoving past a group of stunned students, his shoulder brushing against one of them with a force that made them stumble. As Carter disappeared down the hallway, his eyes glinted with something dangerous, a promise of retaliation that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He whispered to a group of his loyal friends, their heads bent together in a huddle, their glances darting toward Ethan with a menacing intensity. What were they planning? Would Carter let this go? Or was he plotting something to reclaim his power, to remind Ethan of his place? The uncertainty hung in the air, a dark cloud over Ethan's newfound hope, a reminder that his journey was far from over. Ethan's heart raced as he watched them, his mind spinning with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Would they corner him after school, away from the watchful eyes of teachers? Would they sabotage his work, his chances, his future? The thought made his stomach churn, but he pushed it down, focusing on Damien's words, on the strength he'd found within himself. Damien turned back to Ethan, his expression softening further, a quiet intensity in his gaze. "You'll always have people like him trying to push you down," he said, his voice low, but there was a warmth in it, a belief in Ethan that made his chest tighten with emotion. "Don't waste time proving yourself to them. Prove yourself to yourself." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening with determination, a quiet resolve settling over him like a cloak. Damien gave him one last look, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, before stepping away, leaving behind a hallway full of students who would never see Ethan Harper the same way again. Later that day, during a break between classes, Ethan slipped into the school library, seeking a moment of quiet amidst the storm of the day. The library was a sanctuary, its shelves lined with books that smelled of old paper and ink, the soft hum of the air conditioning a soothing contrast to the chaos outside. He found a secluded corner, sinking into a chair with a sigh, his hands still trembling from the morning's events. He pulled out a small, worn photo from his backpack, a picture of him and his mother, taken on his first day at Elite Crest Academy. She had been so proud, her smile wide and bright, her eyes shining with hope as she adjusted his tie, her hands gentle but firm. "You're going to do great things, Ethan," she'd said, her voice filled with a belief that Ethan had never quite felt in himself. Now, staring at the photo, he felt a lump rise in his throat, a mix of gratitude and guilt washing over him. He had come so close to letting her down, to letting her sacrifices be for nothing. But today, Damien Sterling had given him a second chance, a chance to make her proud, to show her that her belief in him wasn't misplaced. He traced her face with his finger, a tear slipping down his cheek as he whispered, "I'll make you proud, Mom. I promise." The words were a vow, a promise to himself as much as to her, a determination to seize this opportunity and never let go. The rest of the day passed in a blur, a mix of cautious glances and whispered conversations. Classes felt different, the air charged with a new energy, a sense of change that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Teachers who once overlooked Ethan now called on him, their voices tinged with a newfound respect, their eyes meeting his with a curiosity that made him sit up straighter. Students who used to whisper behind his back now hesitated before speaking, their words careful, measured, as if they were testing the waters of this new reality. Even the ones who had laughed at him before seemed unsure of where they stood, their sneers replaced by uncertainty, a quiet acknowledgement of the shift that had taken place. The entire school was shifting, and Ethan was at the center of it, a position he had never imagined himself in, a position that both thrilled and terrified him. During lunch, Ethan sat at a table by himself, a habit he'd grown accustomed to over the months, the solitude a shield against the judgment of his peers. He picked at his food, his appetite dulled by the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him, his mind replaying the morning's events over and over. But this time, the isolation didn't last long. A chair scraped against the floor, the sound jarring in the quiet of the cafeteria, and Ethan looked up to see a girl with curly blonde hair and warm brown eyes sitting down across from him. She set down her tray with a small smile, her movements casual but deliberate. "I'm Mia," she said, her voice soft but confident. "We were in history class together last semester. You probably don't remember me." Ethan blinked, caught off guard, his mind scrambling to place her. I think I do," he said, his voice hesitant, a faint memory of her sitting a few rows ahead of him surfacing in his mind. She smiled wider, her eyes crinkling at the corners, a warmth in her gaze that made Ethan's chest loosen just a little. "You don't have to act surprised," she said, her tone light, teasing. "I know no one really talked to you before, but things change." Before Ethan could respond, another voice chimed in, a voice that made his stomach twist with a mix of surprise and apprehension. "Is this seat taken?" Ethan turned to see another student, Liam, a soccer player who had been among those who laughed when Ethan was expelled. But now, his expression was different, almost sheepish, his hands fidgeting with the straps of his backpack. Ethan hesitated, the memory of Liam's laughter still fresh in his mind, but then he shook his head, a small act of courage that felt monumental. "No," he said, his voice steady, a quiet strength in the single word. Liam nodded and sat down, his movements cautious, as if he were afraid of breaking something fragile. Then another student joined, and another, their trays clattering against the table as they settled in. Before long, Ethan's table was full, a small crowd of students surrounding him, their voices a mix of curiosity and tentative friendliness. For the first time ever, Ethan wasn't eating alone, the warmth of their presence a stark contrast to the cold isolation he'd grown accustomed to. From across the cafeteria, Carter Blake watched, his jaw tight, his fists clenched, his eyes burning with a quiet rage. He had ruled the school once, but now his influence was slipping through his fingers like sand, and he knew there was nothing he could do about it. At least, not yet. Ethan had spent years feeling like a shadow at Elite Crest Academy, a name barely worth remembering, a boy who didn't belong in a world of wealth and privilege. But now, as he walked through the halls, something was different. People moved aside when he passed, not out of fear, but out of respect, their eyes following him with a mix of curiosity and admiration. For the first time, he was being seen, his presence acknowledged, his worth recognized. His journey from rejection to redemption taught him a powerful truth. Worth isn't defined by wealth, but by resilience, courage, and the fire to rise above adversity. And in that truth, Ethan found the strength to believe in himself, a lesson that resonates with us all. Hope can bloom even in the darkest moments, if we dare to seize the opportunities that come our way. Reflect on Ethan's story for a moment. Have you ever felt invisible, judged for something beyond your control? How did you find the courage to rise above it? Share your experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you've overcome your own challenges, how you found your own strength in the face of adversity. After lunch, Ethan was walking to class when a familiar voice called his name, the sound cutting through the hum of the hallway like a beacon. He turned to see Damian Sterling standing near the front office, hands in his pockets, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I've been keeping an eye on you," Damian said, his voice warm, a glimmer of pride in his steely blue eyes. "And I must say, you're handling this transition well." Ethan swallowed, his throat tight with emotion, the weight of Damian's words settling over him like a warm blanket. "It still feels unreal," he admitted, his voice soft, the words carrying the weight of his disbelief. Damian smirked, a flicker of amusement in his gaze. "Get used to it," he said, his tone light but firm, a quiet encouragement that made Ethan's chest swell with hope. There was a pause, a moment of quiet reflection, and then Damian's expression shifted, more serious now, his gaze searching. "I didn't do all of this just to make a statement," he said, his voice low, each word deliberate. "I did it because I saw something in you, Ethan, potential, fire, and I want to see where it takes you." Ethan's heart pounded, a mix of gratitude and determination swirling inside him. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Damien reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek silver envelope, its surface shimmering under the fluorescent lights, a promise of something extraordinary. He handed it to Ethan, his gaze steady, unwavering. "This," Damien said, his voice filled with quiet intensity, "is an opportunity. One that could change your life forever." Ethan's fingers tightened around the envelope, his pulse racing, the smooth surface cool against his skin. What could be inside? A scholarship? A mentorship? A chance to prove himself on a bigger stage? The possibilities swirled in his mind, each one more exhilarating than the last. Damien gave him a knowing look, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Don't waste it," he said, his voice a quiet command, a challenge that Ethan felt deep in his bones. And with that, Damien turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the hallway, leaving Ethan standing there, staring at the envelope, knowing that whatever was inside would shape his future in ways he could never imagine. But one thing was certain. Ethan Harper was no longer the boy who had been thrown out of elite Crest Academy. He was a force to be reckoned with, and his story was just beginning. Ethan's journey reminds us that second chances are rare, and they're worth fighting for. Don't miss out on the next chapter of his story, or the countless other life-changing tales we share on Daily Narrated Stories. Subscribe now, hit that notification bell, and join our community of dreamers and fighters, because the next story might just inspire you to rewrite your own destiny. Time is fleeting, and these stories won't wait. Be part of the journey today.